The Aboriginal Student Leadership Council is basically a bunch of Indigenous students from different schools, all from the same district, getting together and talking about all the important Indigenous matters.
The Aboriginal Student Leadership Council is, I think, a collection of students who all are really passionate and like-minded about Indigenous issues and matters. The kind of purpose of it is to really voice our concerns and what needs to change, but also what we're doing good and what we need to focus on, not only in Kamloops, but also I think in BC and Canada.
We discuss issues we find in the school system, and they mostly bring the students in to answer the questions because they want to be from the students' point of view and not the staff's. The purpose is to try and help Indigenous students, I think, feel more connected to schools and feel more ready to talk about their culture and let other people who are non-Indigenous know about their culture so they can have more knowledge on it.
I personally think the Aboriginal Student Leadership Council is really important because I think those policymakers and even teachers and staff in the district need to, be able to hear our voice.
We all get together and talk about these subjects. Getting together with other people from a bunch of different schools lets you see a different perspective.
I think it's important because even though schools do have safe spaces for Indigenous youth to meet and connect, it's not always super well known. So just having another open space, just more district wide, where you can meet even more people. I think it's important also to connect with people that are similar to you because you can't always find that within your school.
You have a group of Indigenous students who work in these spaces every day, and they're given opportunities to make it more comfortable for themselves and other Indigenous students. And also definitely for me, it was a great opportunity in regards to public speaking and making connections.
I think the Student Leadership Council is important because it brings a group of students that don't know each other together, and it allows us as Indigenous students to share our voices.
When we come together, we mostly discuss how the district can improve Aboriginal education. So topics of racism that we've experienced or Indigenous culture in the school, if it's being promoted enough, if it's being celebrated enough, I guess. And overall how the province and the school district can keep on improving those spaces and making Indigenous youth feel more comfortable at school.
Some of the topics that we discuss are anything from anti-Indigenous racism all the way to cultural appropriation or what does Indigenous look like in our modern day?
I feel like anti-Indigenous racism is very important to discuss because there are still stereotypes and there are still people who feel like they're joking around when it comes to our culture, but it can really hurt and affect Indigenous people and how they feel about themselves and can really lower their self-esteem about where they came from if they feel other people do not support them.
For the last few generations, the topic of residential schooling and Indigenous racism has been swept under the rug a little bit. Now that it's coming more to light, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of people are still healing from that, and racism can come from those stereotypes around those people that are healing. So just talking about it and making it more open and normalized in discussions will help us improve.
It isn't always just going up to someone and calling them a half-breed or an Indian, but it can be things like underrepresentation in our school system, not learning about historical events like the 60s scoop, or even the more recently the millennials scoop in day school.
I think teaching about Indigenous culture in the schools is important because it allows me to reconnect with my cultures, and it allows other Indigenous students to reconnect with theirs.
I personally believe that it's really important to discuss Aboriginal cultures at school because even though we are a minority of the total people in our district, we make up a very strong majority of the atrocities that have been committed in Canada. And I think that part of truth and reconciliation is talking about it, putting it onto the open, destigmatizing, and really embracing that sharing of knowledge and ideas so we can work past that and to work towards that reconciliation.
I think it should be talked about more to make people feel more open and welcome. And I think definitely when I have talked about it with people and have heard it talked about in the schools, it makes me feel more comfortable in the schools that I am in.
School should be a safe spot for everyone. So if Indigenous youth are coming to school and they don't feel like valued or noticed or celebrated for their culture and who they are, then they're not going to want to go to that environment. So fostering that safe space within schools for them to like be who they are and have others to connect with that they share culture and like connections with, that'll just like improve the school environment.
Indigenous mental health and wellness is important because statistically, Indigenous youth are the most likely to commit suicide in Canada, and by offering resources and assistance to these youth, I'm confident that one day we can end this cycle.
Talking about mental health and well-being in Indigenous students is so important because people don't realize that sometimes Indigenous people can't maybe talk with people who are not Indigenous because they don't understand their culture, where they're coming from, and maybe some of the techniques they can use to help themselves.
With all this intergenerational trauma and tyranny that we have faced, we need to be able to talk about that. And when you're having a mental health crisis, sometimes the best place isn't to go to a hospital, but it's to go to your uncle or your auntie's house and sit down and talk about it. And I think that if we can open that conversation up to a wider community of not only just Indigenous people, but also more broadly to colonial people and to other people so that we can, support one another.
I feel like the Aboriginal Leadership Council will help create change in our community because they are determined and they actually want to help the Indigenous people get better. I know that these people on the council are definitely determined and want to help people more, so they will be more likely to actually take action.
My hope is one day that Indigenous youth are able to thrive, and I plan to be a part of that by sharing my voice as an Indigenous youth.
I'm hoping that some change in the near future will be created to support not only just First Nations, but Métis and Inuit people too.
In the end, I just hope for more improvement in not like only our district, not only our schools, but in the province and the nation when it comes to like Indigenous communities that are still healing from past traumas. I just hope that they can find those spaces to heal without judgment and without stereotypes and stigmas. Just a place that they can all come, celebrate who they are, celebrate their culture, and connect with one another.